The Galactic Council had seen many strange things throughout its long history, but none of them had prepared the universe for what happened when an alien girl, raised in a distant star system, made contact with Earth. It began under a golden sky where a single Terran research ship floated silently at the edge of a neutral star zone, its silver hull gleaming against the vast darkness. Inside, scientists and diplomats watched their instruments nervously, waiting for the arrival of the delegation from the Verith Empire. The mission was supposed to be routine, another first contact meeting with a young species curious about humans. But this one was different. Among the alien diplomats was a girl who looked almost human, tall, elegant, her violet eyes glowing faintly in the dim light of the council chamber. She had studied human culture through transmissions and data streams for years, but she never thought what she learned was real. When she stepped aboard the Terran vessel and faced real humans for the first time, her curious question would shake every member of the crew and ignite one of the strangest diplomatic encounters in history. The meeting began quietly. Humans and Verithians exchanged the usual greetings, discussing alliances, trade routes, and science. Yet the girl's eyes never left one human scientist, a young biologist named Alex. She watched his hands move as he spoke, listened to his laugh, studied his breathing patterns. Her species reproduced in sterile, mechanical ways, cells grown in luminous tanks, relationships dictated by genetic codes. But humans, she had read, were different. They bonded. They touched. They shared warmth. And as the talks went on, she leaned closer and whispered a single question that made the air around the table freeze. Humans reproduce like that? Teach me. The silence that followed was heavier than the ship's gravity field. Alex nearly dropped the data pad from his hand. Every human officer stared at her. Every alien delegate tilted their heads in confusion. And the universe, in that small corner of space, held its breath. Her question wasn't just curiosity. It was a cultural explosion waiting to happen. In the Verithian world, reproduction was cold and controlled. There were no emotions, no connections, no families in the way humans understood them. Yet here was one of their own, fascinated by something so human it cut straight to the soul. Alex struggled to find words, but the captain stepped forward, voice calm but firm, explaining that human reproduction wasn't just biological. It was emotional, sacred, shared between people who trusted each other. The alien girl tilted her head again, her violet eyes glowing brighter. That sounds alive, she whispered. That moment rippled through both crews like a starquake. The Verithian delegates grew uneasy. They had long kept emotions buried deep beneath logic and control. Love, touch, intimacy. These were considered dangerous distractions that once tore their species apart in ancient wars. They feared what they could not control. But this young girl, born into their system yet different, had broken the unspoken rule: never envy humanity. The council back home would not be pleased. And as whispers spread through the ship's corridors, something far greater than one awkward question began to stir. Outside the ship, the Galactic Council had been watching. They always watched humanity. To them, humans were unpredictable, emotional, dangerous. Their ability to bond fiercely, to fight with everything they had for those bonds, made them both feared and admired. And now, with a single alien girl's request, the Council's fragile walls began to crack. If Verithians started questioning their sterile system, the Council's control over them might shatter. Secret transmissions raced through the stars. Orders were whispered. And in the darkness, a Council fleet began to move closer, cloaked and silent. Meanwhile, aboard the Terran ship, Alex spent long hours talking to the alien girl, whose name was Scylla. She asked endless questions about how humans lived, how they loved, how they built families that lasted lifetimes. She didn't understand why people would cry when holding a child or why they would fight wars to protect the ones they loved. Because it matters, Alex said softly one night as the ship drifted past a silent nebula. It's what makes us human. Scylla closed her eyes, trying to imagine a world where people chose each other, not because of genetic codes, but because of something real. She whispered that she wanted to feel that once before she died. But not everyone shared her wonder. A Verithian commander intercepted her messages and alerted the council. Within hours, The Terran vessel was surrounded by Council ships, their black hulls swallowing the stars. A deep, cold voice echoed through the comms demanding that Scylla be returned immediately. They called her a traitor, a contamination. They accused humanity of corrupting their young. Inside the Terran ship, tension climbed like a rising storm. The crew debated what to do. They could hand her over and avoid war, or they could protect her and defy the Council. Scylla stood silently in the corner, tears welling in her glowing eyes, realizing her small wish might have started something unstoppable. Alex walked to her, placing a hand on her trembling shoulder. "We protect our own," he whispered. Those words set everything into motion. The Terran captain refused the Council's demand. War alarms echoed through the ship. Fighters launched into the blackness like silver arrows. Scylla watched humans move as one, not because of orders, but because of choice. And for the first time in her life, she understood what power really was. Not ships, not weapons, but the unshakable bond that made humans stand together when the galaxy turned against them. The Council unleashed their ships, but the Terrans were ready. They moved with precision, heart, and fury. The battle lit the sky in blue and gold fire. Alien fleets expected humans to surrender. Instead, they watched a small crew fight like an entire species burned behind their eyes. Scylla stood at the command deck, tears falling as she saw humans risk their lives for her. She shouted in Varethian across the comms, begging her people to stop, telling them she had found something real. Some Varethian captains hesitated. Some lowered their weapons. For the first time in centuries, cracks formed in their perfect, emotionless wall. The Council realized too late what they had unleashed. Humanity had not just defended a girl. They had lit a spark inside an entire species. The battle ended not with destruction but with silence as Varethian captains turned their ships away, refusing to fight their own. Scylla stood beside Alex on the deck, looking at the stars, feeling something she had never felt before, belonging. She whispered, "You taught me what it means to be alive." And as the Terran ship drifted toward the light of a new dawn, the Galactic Council watched with fear in their hearts. Humanity had once again changed the galaxy, not with conquest, but with the simple, unstoppable power of connection. If you enjoyed this cinematic HFY sci-fi story about humanity, aliens, the Galactic Council, and First Contact, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps bring more thrilling space stories to life. Stay tuned for the next chapter in humanity's journey among the stars. The battle in orbit had only been the beginning. Long after the plasma trails cooled and the stars returned to silence, the true weight of what had happened began to sink into the hearts of everyone aboard the Terran vessel. Scylla stood near the viewport, watching the Council fleet disappear into the endless dark, her violet eyes reflecting the slow swirl of distant galaxies. She could still feel the trembling of the ship beneath her feet, still hear the echoes of Terran pilots shouting into comms, still see the moment when Varethian ships lowered their weapons and refused to fire. That image would never leave her. It was the moment something ancient inside her species cracked, and the moment she finally understood why the Council feared humanity so much. They didn't fear Terran technology. They feared the way humans could make others feel. Down in the medical bay, wounded crew members lay in clean white light. The scent of burned steel and ozone still clung to their uniforms. Alex sat by a stretcher, wiping blood from his cheek, his hands shaking, not from fear, but from what had almost been lost. Around him, soldiers and engineers laughed softly through their pain, clapping each other's shoulders, whispering that they'd made history. Scylla walked in slowly, almost hesitant, as if stepping into a sacred place. She looked at the humans, bruised, scarred, exhausted, but still smiling. She couldn't understand it. Her kind would have hidden their wounds, covered their faces in shame. But these people wore their pain openly, as proof of what they stood for. When Alex looked up at her, his tired smile was warmer than any star she had ever seen. "You okay?" he asked. She didn't know how to answer. No one had ever asked her that before. In Varethian society, Feelings didn't matter. People didn't care. Yet here, even after risking their lives for her, he still cared how she felt. Her throat tightened as something unfamiliar spread through her chest. Soft, frightening, powerful. She nodded slowly, though her hands trembled. "I don't understand why you did this," she whispered. Alex leaned back against the wall, his eyes unfocused on the ceiling as if remembering the chaos outside. "Because you matter," he said simply. Hours turned into a quiet night aboard the ship, and whispers spread across the galaxy faster than light. The Council's attack had failed, but what scared them more wasn't their defeat. It was the way some Varethian captains had chosen to defy orders. That had never happened before. Entire fleets that were once loyal to the Council were suddenly silent. No reports, no acknowledgements, no bowing to the Council's authority. Like a hairline fracture on ancient glass, something irreversible had begun. Meanwhile, Scylla couldn't sleep. She walked through the silent corridors of the ship, past the glowing panels, past the tired faces of humans who nodded at her like she was one of them. No one called her a burden. No one blamed her for the war they almost lost. They just accepted her. She paused at the observation deck where Alex sat alone, watching the blue shimmer of a nebula outside. He didn't look like a warrior or a diplomat. He looked like someone carrying the weight of choices he never wanted to make. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. He turned his head slightly. "No," he said after a moment. "But I'll never forget it either." Scylla slowly stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "My people, they were taught that emotions make us weak. That connection is dangerous. That love breaks civilizations apart." She placed a hand on the glass, watching her reflection blur into the stars. "But what I saw out there wasn't weakness. It was something I can't name." Alex leaned forward, his arms resting on his knees. "It's why they fear us. Not because we fight better, but because we feel stronger than anyone else. And once someone feels it, they can't go back to being empty." Far beyond that quiet ship, in the frozen marble halls of the Galactic Council, the High Chair convened an emergency session. Alien delegates filled the grand chamber, their bodies casting long shadows on the crystalline floor. Holographic feeds showed fleets wavering in loyalty, captains questioning orders, messages intercepted that spoke of a single alien girl who had defected, not through violence, but through choice. Whispers rose like storm winds. If one species like the Varethians could begin to question their foundations, what would stop the others? The Council Chancellor slammed his clawed hand on the table, declaring humanity a galactic contagion. But behind the speeches and threats, fear pulsed in every corner. They couldn't stop an idea. And humanity, unknowingly, had just planted a seed in the heart of the galaxy. Back on the Terran ship, Scylla found herself spending every moment among the crew. She helped with repairs, learned their language more deeply, and listened to their stories of Earth. Oceans, forests, laughter around campfires, the way people held each other when the world went dark. Each story painted a picture she'd never known was possible. She had grown up in sterile halls, listening to machines hum instead of human laughter. She had been told that bonds made people fragile. But she saw strength in the way these humans leaned on one another. Then, the message came. A council ultimatum. Return Scylla within 3 standard cycles or face full war. No negotiations. No mercy. The captain read it aloud in the command room. The crew went silent. No one doubted the council's power. Their fleets outnumbered humanity's 10-1. But Alex's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "They think fear will make us bend. But they don't understand. We don't bend. We stand." The captain's jaw clenched, and slowly, one by one, the officers nodded. Humanity had survived worse than the council before. They wouldn't surrender someone who had trusted them. Scylla listened, her chest tightening with emotion she didn't fully understand. She stepped forward, her voice trembling. "I never wanted this. I never wanted war." The captain placed a hand on her shoulder. "War isn't what you caused. It's what they brought. All you did was be brave. For a species that feared emotion, she had committed the greatest rebellion of all. She had felt. And now the galaxy would burn or bloom because of it. As the Terran fleet assembled quietly around their ship, Scylla stood among them wearing a human flight jacket too big for her slender frame. The engines roared softly beneath her feet. For the first time in her life, she wasn't alone, and that truth gave her courage she didn't know she had. Outside the viewport, Terran warships formed a protective ring, their hulls glowing like silent sentinels in the void. Humanity wasn't hiding. They were waiting. The Council believed they could force a surrender. They didn't understand what they were up against. They weren't facing just a fleet. They were facing a species that had learned, through centuries of pain and survival, to fight hardest when someone tried to take away their right to choose. And Scylla, the alien girl who once whispered a curious question, now stood at the heart of that storm, realizing she had become part of something far larger than herself. The second act of this story wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about what happens when humanity's flame touches a world built on cold and darkness. The stars themselves seemed to lean closer, waiting to see if that spark would light a revolution or a war that would change the galaxy forever. The stars stretched endlessly outside the Terran fleet, cold and silent, but beneath that silence, war drums were beginning to beat. The Galactic Council had not expected humanity to refuse their ultimatum. For centuries, they had bullied smaller species with their fleets, with their iron rules, with their promise of order. No one ever said no. No one ever stood their ground. But humanity did. And now the Council prepared to make an example of them. Across a dozen star systems, their fleets moved like shadows through the dark, silent, invisible, surrounding humanity's borders with the quiet patience of a predator before the strike. Inside the Terran flagship, the air felt different. It was heavy, electric, alive with a quiet determination that made even seasoned soldiers speak in whispers. Scylla could feel it in her bones. The humans weren't afraid. They were ready. In the command center, holographic displays floated above polished steel floors. Red markers blinked across the galactic map like droplets of blood. Council fleets here. Council fleets there. The room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and ionized air from overworked equipment. Officers moved like clockwork, their voices calm but sharp. They had all seen war before, but this one felt different. This wasn't about territory. This was about humanity itself. Alex stood near the central console, hands clasped tightly behind his back, his jaw clenched. He wasn't a soldier. He was a scientist who had simply answered a girl's question. But now that question had turned into a storm threatening to swallow entire civilizations. He could hear the low hum of reactors beneath the deck, feel the subtle vibration of weapons charging in the lower levels. Scylla entered the command room quietly, wearing the same oversized flight jacket. Her violet eyes darted between the glowing red fleet markers, and for a moment, she wondered if this was what fear truly felt like. Not the cold fear of punishment she'd grown up with, but the warm, sharp fear of losing something that finally mattered. When Alex turned toward her, she forced a smile, but he saw the uncertainty beneath it. "They're coming," she whispered. "They always do," Alex replied softly. "But so do we." Beyond the walls of the ship, in a corner of the galaxy no one dared to enter, the Council was holding a private war council. Inside a vast chamber carved from black stone and glass, alien delegates sat in rows beneath a massive glowing crest of the Council's seal. They were furious. Furious that one alien girl had dared to question their way of life. Furious that humans, of all species, had dared to protect her. The Chancellor's deep voice echoed through the hall as he declared humanity a contaminant, a species that spread dangerous emotions like wildfire. "We cannot allow them to infect the galaxy with their chaos," he growled. "We strike. Not to win a war, but to erase their defiance." And with those words, fleets were ordered to advance. But what the Council had never truly understood was that humanity had long been preparing for something like this. Not because they sought war, but because history had taught them that if they wanted peace, they had to be ready when war came knocking. The Terran fleet wasn't the largest in the galaxy, but it was forged in fire, born from centuries of fighting stronger enemies and refusing to kneel. While other species built perfect weapons, humanity built fighters who carried their homes in their hearts. Scylla spent the next hours walking through the ship's lower decks. She saw pilots strapping into their fighters, faces calm but focused. She saw engineers covered in grease, singing old Earth songs while tightening bolts and welding armor plates. She saw medics prepping quiet bays, setting out clean white sheets, knowing some of them would be used tonight. She had never seen anything like this. On Varithia, soldiers were silent machines who obeyed commands without thought. Here, humans chose to stand together. They made jokes, they hugged, they whispered to loved ones through old holoscreens. They fought with heart. And that made them terrifying in ways no council weapon could match. Up in the hangar, Alex stood beside a squad of pilots preparing their interceptors. He wasn't a warrior, but he felt the storm closing in. Scylla approached him, the sound of engines and footsteps surrounding them. "Why aren't you afraid?" she asked softly. He looked at her, his expression a mix of fire and calm. "We've always lived with someone bigger trying to control us. But we've learned something they never have. When humans fight for someone they care about, we don't stop." His voice wasn't loud, but every pilot around them heard it. Heads lifted. Shoulders straightened. Fear shifted into something sharper. Far away, the first council fleet slipped out of cloak. 30 warships like floating obsidian daggers appeared on the Terran border. Their commander gave no speech, no warning. They were here to crush, not to talk. The alarm klaxons on the Terran flagship screamed like ancient sirens. Red lights painted the corridors as the crew ran to stations. The ship's AI flickered to life, calm and emotionless, but every human heartbeat was alive with fire. Scylla grabbed the railing as the ship thrummed under her feet, engines pushing them forward into the dark. The first wave hit like thunder. Council railfire streaked through the black, slamming into Terran shields. The ship shook, lights flickered, but the fleet didn't break. They answered back with rail cannons and plasma bursts that cut through the void like burning comets. Fighters screamed out of hangars in perfect formation, small but fierce, like a swarm of starlings against giants. Scylla stood at the viewport, her breath fogging the glass, watching humans move like one living organism. It was brutal. It was beautiful. And it terrified her in ways she couldn't describe. On the bridge, the captain's voice cut through the chaos. "Target their formation. They expect fear, give them fury." The Terran fleet moved like wolves, fast and unpredictable. They didn't follow council doctrine. They didn't wait for orders from above. They adapted, they improvised, they struck where no one expected. Council ships fell one by one, their black hulls burning orange against the cold void. For the first time in centuries, the council realized they weren't fighting just another obedient species. They were fighting humanity. In the middle of the storm, Scylla's mind raced. She had grown up believing emotions made people weak. But here, she saw the truth. Emotions didn't weaken humans. They made them unstoppable. Every laugh, every tear, every bond they formed was a weapon the council couldn't control. She pressed her hands against the glass as two council ships collided trying to outmaneuver human pilots. "They are winning," she whispered, not out of pride, but out of disbelief. Alex, his hands covered in grease and sweat, glanced at her. "No," he said. "We're just reminding them who we are." The council commander barked orders, furious, refusing to retreat. But deep in their ranks, Varithian captains hesitated again. They had heard Scylla's voice before, during the first battle. They had watched her choose humanity over the cold chains of the council. And now, seeing humans fight not for conquest but for someone they cared about, their doubts grew louder. Some lowered their guns. Some ignored attack commands. The council's perfect wall of control was fracturing again, not because of weapons, but because of one idea. Hours passed like minutes. The battle ended with the Terran fleet still standing. Scars marked their hulls, and smoke hung in the air, but their spirits burned hotter than ever. Council ships limped away, their formation shattered. Humanity had bled, but the council had broken. Scylla stood at the center of the bridge, surrounded by humans who laughed through their exhaustion. She felt something inside her shift. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She was part of it. Part of something alive, dangerous, and unstoppable. In the council chambers, panic spread like fire. The Chancellor roared, demanding more fleets, demanding Sila's capture, demanding that humanity be erased before their disease spread. But behind him, quiet whispers grew among delegates. Some had seen the transmissions of the battle. Some had seen the faces of humans fighting together. Some had begun to wonder if the Council's way was really the only way. The galaxy was beginning to tilt, and it tilted toward Earth. That night, as the Terran fleet floated in the dark, Alex sat beside Sila in the silent observation deck. Her hands were still trembling. She whispered, "I never thought one question could do all this." Alex stared at the stars. "It's not just a question," he said softly. "It's a spark. And sparks don't ask permission before they burn the world." She closed her eyes and let out a shaky breath, realizing that the war wasn't just between fleets. It was between two ways of living, one built on control, and the other on connection. And humanity's fire was just beginning to spread. The galaxy didn't sleep after that battle. Even in the farthest reaches of the Council's territory, whispers traveled faster than light. Whole star systems that had never dared to speak against the Council suddenly found themselves talking in quiet corners about the Terrans, the humans who had faced the Council's war fleet and walked away standing. The story of one alien girl and one human scientist was no longer just a rumor aboard a single ship. It had become a spark slipping through the cracks of an empire that had ruled in silence for centuries. In the Council's grand chamber, darkness hung over the long, curved rows of alien delegates. Their cold blue lights glowed on the black stone walls. The Chancellor's claws raked across the table as he growled that humanity was becoming a contagion. "They spread emotion like fire," he said. "And once it burns, no wall can hold it." But behind those cold alien eyes, some delegates shifted uncomfortably. They had seen the battle. They had seen Terrans fight like creatures with something more powerful than orders. They fought with meaning. Meanwhile, aboard the Terran flagship Resolute, the atmosphere was heavy, not with fear, but with the aftertaste of survival. The hull bore black streaks from plasma hits, the hangar smelled of scorched alloy and sweat, but the humans moved through it like they always had, laughing, fixing, carrying their scars like badges. Sila walked through the corridors slowly, her boots echoing softly on the metal floors. No one avoided her. No one whispered behind her back. Pilots she barely knew nodded at her with respect. Engineers called her Little Spark, the nickname they gave her after she had stood at the viewport during the battle, trembling but unbroken. She had never belonged anywhere before, and now she belonged in a place that the galaxy itself feared. Alex sat in the mess hall surrounded by tired soldiers eating whatever was left in ration warmers. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, dark rings under his eyes, hair a mess, but there was a calmness to him. He had watched death fly past his window, seen flames dance across black space, but he had also seen something no scientist could ever measure: the moment an entire fleet refused to bend. When Sila sat across from him, holding a cup of something hot that smelled like cinnamon and smoke, they didn't need to speak right away. The silence between them was warm. "I never thought I'd be part of a war," Alex said quietly. Sila tilted her head. "Neither did I. But it feels like it's not just a war anymore." She stared into the steam rising from her cup. "It feels like a choice the whole galaxy is being forced to make." Far away, in the Council's outer provinces, that choice was already reaching the unlikeliest corners. On a frozen mining station orbiting a dim red star, Varethian workers whispered Sila's name. They whispered about the human fleet, about how some captains had lowered their guns. For generations they had lived in quiet obedience, believing their feelings made them weak. But when they saw a girl like them choose something else, they felt something stir in their chest, something they had forgotten they could feel. The Council sent in forces to crush the whispers, but whispers spread like smoke. Back aboard the Resolute, preparations were already underway for what everyone knew would come next. The Council wouldn't back down. They never did. They would return, not with a single fleet, but with an armada meant to wipe Earth from the stars. But this time, humanity wouldn't be alone. Hidden transmissions began to flow in from sympathetic Varethian captains. Some offered information. Others promised neutrality. And a few, the brave ones, swore they would fight beside humanity when the moment came. The Terran command room glowed with shifting maps as ships across Earth's colonies began to mobilize. Fleets that had been silent for years now lit up on long-range scans like constellations waking up. Scylla found herself watching it all from a corner of the bridge. Her mind spun as she tried to understand how one small act of curiosity had led to this storm. She had once lived in a world where reproduction was mechanical, emotions were contained, and love was a myth. But now she was standing in a storm built not by weapons, but by feeling. She walked down to the hangar again, where she found pilots writing small messages on the noses of their fighters. Names of loved ones, jokes, words of strength. When she asked why, a pilot grinned and said, "Because we fly for someone, not something." She didn't know it, but that sentence would echo across the galaxy in the months to come. In a quiet part of the ship, Alex received a secure message from the Terran Council back on Earth. It was short but clear: the Council's armada is assembling. Expect full war. All Terran fleets are mobilizing. Hold the line. He read it twice, his heart beat heavy in his chest. He wasn't a general. He was just a scientist who had been at the wrong place, or the right one, at the perfect time. He closed the message, stepped out into the corridor, and saw Scylla waiting there, her violet eyes searching his face. "They're coming again, aren't they?" she whispered. Alex nodded slowly. "Yes, and they'll come harder this time." But something was different now. The humans weren't just preparing to defend themselves. They were preparing to inspire. This war wasn't just about protecting Scylla anymore. It was about shaking a council that had ruled through fear for centuries. They knew they might not survive. But they also knew that if they could hold, even for a little while, the entire galaxy would see that the council could bleed. Back in the council chamber, the Chancellor barked orders like a beast cornered. His eyes burned as he declared, "If the galaxy sees them stand, others will follow. We must crush them before the spark becomes a fire." His advisors, usually silent, shifted in their seats. Some hesitated. Some asked quiet questions. And in that hesitation, the Chancellor saw the first fracture in their power. The night before the Armada was expected to arrive, the Terran crew gathered on the observation deck. No one spoke of fear. No one gave speeches. Instead, they shared stories. Stories of Earth, of oceans and forests, of places Scylla had never seen. They spoke of holding hands under falling snow, of families that waited at windows for ships to return home, of the fire that burned in them when everything else fell apart. Scylla listened, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She had grown up in a world where no one spoke like this, where no one cared like this. And in that moment, she realized why the Council would lose. They could build fleets, but they couldn't build this. In the distance, long-range scanners lit up. The Armada had entered the edge of human space. Hundreds of Council ships moved in tight formation like a wall of black steel blotting out the stars. The Resolute hummed softly as the crew went to stations. Pilots kissed dog tags, engineers strapped into harnesses, and Alex stood at the viewport beside Scylla. "This is it," he said quietly. She reached out and gripped his hand. For a heartbeat, their palms pressed together, and she felt something she had never felt before: home. The Council believed they were bringing an end to a rebellion. But they were wrong. They were stepping into a firestorm that no amount of cold could ever put out. And at the heart of it stood humanity, scarred, stubborn, furious, and unbreakable, ready to teach the galaxy why their greatest weapon had never been their ships. It was their hearts. The storm was coming, and the galaxy was about to change forever. The Black Armada appeared like a storm swallowing the stars, row upon row of Council warships gliding silently through the void. There were so many of them that they looked like a moving wall of night, their cold blue running lights stretching across half the Terran frontier. Inside the command deck of the Resolute, the atmosphere tightened with every passing second. Officers watched their scanners in silence, faces lit by the red glow of tactical displays. The enemy wasn't creeping toward them anymore. They were already here. Humanity's defiance had drawn the full wrath of the Galactic Council. And this time there would be no demands, no negotiations, no ultimatums. This was war in its purest form. Scylla stood at the main viewport, her hands pressed against the cold glass. She could feel the tremor of distant engines through the ship's hull, like the beating of some massive creature in the dark. It was breathtaking and terrifying at the same time. She had grown up hearing about Council armadas, unbeatable, merciless, precise, but she had never seen one. Now she understood why entire civilizations surrendered without a fight. But she also saw something the Council didn't. She saw the humans standing beneath this darkness, and not a single one of them looked ready to kneel. Alex walked to her side, his voice low, steady, almost unnaturally calm. That's more ships than I've ever seen in one place. Scylla nodded slowly. They won't stop, she whispered. He glanced at her, then back at the endless dark. Neither will we. It wasn't arrogance. It was the quiet certainty of a species that had spent its entire history fighting against odds that were never in its favor. Across the fleet, pilots slid into their fighters, their hands steady on the controls. In engineering decks, crews locked down reactors and sealed bulkheads, their voices rising in practiced rhythm. On the bridge, the captain gave quiet, sharp orders as the Terran fleet repositioned itself, not as a line meant to block, but as a storm waiting to strike. Humanity never won wars by playing fair. They won by being unpredictable. And the Council was about to learn that again. Deep in the Council Armada, inside a flagship carved from black alloy and obsidian plating, the Chancellor watched the Terran formation through a wall of holographic displays. His expression was carved from stone. They will resist, his advisor said. Good, the Chancellor growled. Then we'll make an example out of them that no world will ever forget. The Council's plan was simple. Overwhelm the humans fast and hard, crush their fleet in one stroke, and broadcast their defeat across the galaxy. Fear was their weapon, and it had never failed them. Until now. The first wave came like a hammer. Council carriers unleashed hundreds of sleek attack drones, their wings folding open like knives in the dark. Missiles flared through space like streaks of lightning, filling the void with burning trails. Alarms screamed across the Terran fleet, but no one ran. Instead, the Terran interceptors launched like a swarm of hornets, engines blazing, their pilots grinning through adrenaline. Scylla watched from the bridge as those tiny ships, fragile compared to the black war machines of the Council, dove straight into the storm. They didn't hesitate. They didn't falter. They moved like living fire. The first collisions lit the sky with fire. Terran fighters moved in unpredictable patterns. No rigid formations, no flawless timing, just instinct, speed, and fury. Council drones, programmed to predict logic, couldn't keep up with chaos. Missiles curved off course, enemy formations cracked. The fleet had expected obedience, not wildfire. The Terran capital ships followed seconds later. Rail cannons roared. Plasma beams tore through the black armada like lightning through a storm front. Explosions blossomed like dying stars, and the night bled orange. Scylla could barely breathe as the battle unfolded. She watched humans fight like no species she had ever seen. They weren't stronger. They weren't faster. But they cared more than their enemies. Every ship fought like someone's home was on the line, because it was. Council warships fired in tight, predictable patterns, relying on their overwhelming power. But humans adapted. They split, regrouped, struck from angles the Council never accounted for. It wasn't clean. It wasn't pretty. It was terrifying. Alex leaned over the tactical console, sweat sliding down the side of his face. They're breaking their second formation, he said. The captain's voice cut through the room like a blade. Good. Make them bleed. Far across the battlefield, something unexpected began to happen. Some Varethian ships, placed on the flanks of the Council Armada, didn't fire. They didn't advance. Their captains stared at the chaos before them, at the sight of humanity standing against impossible odds. They heard the old whispers that had started after the first battle. They remembered the girl who had defied the Council. And one by one, Lights began to flicker on their ships as they powered down their weapons. The Council noticed. They sent urgent override codes. Some ignored them. Others switched sides entirely. Scylla's breath caught when she saw Varethian signals appear in green on the Terran tactical map. Alex's eyes widened. "They're joining us?" he whispered. "No," Scylla said, her voice shaking. "They're remembering what it means to choose." The Chancellor roared in fury when reports reached his command deck. He slammed a clawed hand against the table, cracking the obsidian. "Traitors," he spat. But even his own generals hesitated now. The Council had ruled through fear for so long, but fear was brittle. And once it cracked, it shattered fast. The battle raged on for hours. Council forces hammered the Terrans with brutal, relentless precision, but humanity refused to break. Damaged ships stayed in the fight. Pilots who should have ejected kept flying. Destroyers with cracked hulls fired their last rounds not to survive, but to make their enemies pay. Scylla stood frozen as she realized why no one had ever truly conquered Earth. You couldn't scare a species that had already learned to live in the dark. When the third wave came, it met not a broken fleet, but a rising storm. Reinforcements from distant Terran colonies poured in, old ships, fast ships, ugly ships, but they came. And they came because humanity had never been about one world. It was about people. About bonds. About the refusal to kneel. Council formations buckled under the pressure. Entire wings of Varethian ships turned against their masters. The black wall of the Armada began to tear apart. Inside the Council flagship, panic clawed at the edges of control. Alarms blared, reports flooded in, and the Chancellor stared at the chaos with wide, furious eyes. "This is impossible," he hissed. But it wasn't. It was humanity. It was exactly what he had feared the most. Not their weapons. Not their ships. Their fire. On the Resolute, Alex stood shoulder to shoulder with Scylla as the bridge shook around them. Flames burned in distant corridors, crews shouted over alarms, but no one looked away from the viewport. They watched their fighters surge like a living wave. "They can throw the whole galaxy at us," Alex whispered. "We'll still be here." Scylla's throat tightened. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to fight for something bigger than yourself. The Council had thought this would be the end of humanity. But as their armada broke apart under the weight of human defiance and the growing tide of rebellion, they began to understand the truth. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning of a war they could no longer control. The spark had become a fire, and it was spreading fast. Somewhere in the distance, a massive Council battleship exploded in a bloom of golden light. Cheers erupted across the Terran comms, exhausted but fierce. And at the center of it all, Scylla stared at the stars and realized that her single question, the one whispered in curiosity and innocence, had just rewritten the future of the galaxy. The galaxy burned with the echoes of war. The once impenetrable black wall of the Council's armada had cracked and splintered into chaos. Smoke and fire drifted across the void like wounded shadows, and the stars flickered faintly behind the drifting wreckage of broken warships. Alarms still wailed softly through the corridors of the Resolute, and the floor trembled from distant impacts, but something had shifted, something irreversible. For the first time in centuries, the Galactic Council had not crushed its enemy. It had been forced to fight back. And worse for them, it had bled. Scylla stood near the viewport, her violet eyes reflecting the glow of burning hulls drifting silently through the void. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had spent her entire life hearing that the Council could not be stopped, that resistance was pointless, that obedience was survival. But now, she was watching Council warships scatter like frightened insects, their perfect formations shattered by a species they had dismissed as reckless and emotional. Behind her, exhausted human pilots stumbled into the hangar, their flight suits streaked with smoke and grease, their tired smiles carved into faces lit by victory's fragile fire. Alex leaned against the tactical console, his uniform soaked with sweat, his breathing ragged, but his eyes still sharp. He stared at the flickering holographic map where red Council markers were being replaced by gray blips, destroyed or retreating. The Terran fleet was battered. Hulls were cracked, ammunition was low, lives had been lost, but they were still here. No other species had ever forced the council to retreat on this scale. He whispered under his breath, "They'll never forget this night." Scylla turned toward him slowly, her voice soft, almost uncertain. "Neither will I." In the depths of space, scattered council ships regrouped under fractured chains of command. The Chancellor sat in the shattered war room of his flagship, clawed hands gripping the table so hard the obsidian cracked. His eyes burned with rage as officers shouted over each other, reporting mutinies among the Varethian wings and entire sectors refusing to answer orders. He slammed his fist down, silencing them all. "Humanity," he hissed. "A primitive species of flesh and fire, and they dare to defy the council? No. They will not live to see this victory." He demanded a second strike, but for the first time in history, not every commander obeyed. Fear was no longer working like it used to. Back aboard the Resolute, the aftermath unfolded like a quiet storm. In the medbay, rows of wounded soldiers lay beneath soft white lights. Some whispered to each other, others stared blankly at the ceiling. They were exhausted but proud. Engineers crawled across the damaged decks, welding plates and sealing breaches, their laughter thin but real. The smell of smoke clung to everything. Scylla walked through it slowly, brushing her fingers along the cold metal of the walls, feeling the pulse of a living ship that refused to die. She passed by a mechanic singing softly to herself while fixing a cracked pipe and a pilot tracing the name of a fallen wingmate on the side of his fighter. It was messy. It was imperfect. It was human. And it was beautiful. She found Alex sitting alone in the observation bay, staring out at the battlefield beyond the glass. He didn't move when she approached. He just exhaled slowly and whispered, "We shouldn't have survived that." She sat beside him, her hands resting in her lap. "But you did." He turned to her, his eyes tired but burning. "No. We did. You, me, them, the whole damn galaxy that's watching this. This isn't just about us anymore, Scylla. You know that, right?" She nodded slowly. She knew. The council had ruled for too long. Now the cracks in their control were spreading faster than they could seal them. And all of it had started with a question whispered between two strangers. In distant systems, transmissions from the battle spread like wildfire. Species who had lived under the council's shadow for generations gathered around flickering screens in quiet awe. They saw humans fight without surrender. They saw Varethian ships turning their guns away. They saw the great council armada retreat. Whispers rose in marketplaces, in mining stations, in frozen colonies at the edge of known space. Some called it the Night of Fire. Others called it the human spark. The name didn't matter. What mattered was that hope, a word many had forgotten, had returned. The council tried to smother those whispers with threats and fear, but it was too late. Entire sectors began questioning their loyalties. Small rebellions ignited across the spiral arms. Patrol fleets defected. Varethian soldiers who had once marched like machines now paused when given orders. Scylla's people were changing faster than anyone could control. She had once been one voice in the void. Now her name was spoken like a symbol. On the Resolute, preparations for the inevitable next wave had already begun. The humans knew the council would return. Empires didn't collapse quietly, but they also knew they were no longer alone. Messages came in from independent fleets, Varethian, Trillan, Noxian, species who had lived under council control for centuries. Some pledged weapons. Some pledged ships. Others simply said, "We're ready to choose." It wasn't an alliance yet. It wasn't an army. But it was a spark, and sparks had a way of turning into wildfires. Scylla stood before the gathered crew in the central hangar, her hands trembling slightly. She wasn't a leader. She wasn't a warrior. She was just a girl who had asked a question. But when she looked out at the faces watching her, human faces tired but proud, she felt something rising inside her. "My people were taught to fear feelings," she began softly. "We were taught that love was weakness. That connection would destroy us. But tonight, I saw what it really does. It gives strength. It gives courage. And it can make an entire empire tremble." The hangar fell silent as her voice steadied. The Council is afraid. And they should be. Because they cannot destroy what they don't understand. And they will never understand this. She placed a hand over her heart. This is what makes humanity dangerous. The crew erupted into cheers, not the neat, rehearsed kind, but the wild, raw sound of people who had fought the impossible and lived to tell the story. Alex stood at the edge of the crowd, smiling faintly as Sila's words echoed through the ship's hull like a heartbeat. But far away, in the shadows of deep space, the Chancellor plotted his next move. He had underestimated humanity once. He would not do it again. If the galaxy was beginning to turn, he would burn it before letting it slip away. His last words to his advisors that night were cold as steel. If they wish to make this a war of hearts, he said, then let us break their hearts first. As the Resolute drifted slowly among the stars, Alex and Sila stood side by side at the viewport once more. The stars looked different now, not as distant, not as cold. They were the stars of a galaxy that was changing. Humanity had shown the universe that power wasn't just measured in fleets and guns. Power could be something softer, something the Council never understood. Loyalty, connection, emotion. The war wasn't over. The Council would return. Blood would be spilled again. But humanity had done the impossible. They had made the galaxy believe that the Council could fall. And Sila, the alien girl who once whispered a single question in a quiet room, realized that she was no longer a bystander. She was part of history now. Alex looked at her, his voice calm but fierce. We lit the fire, Sila. Now the whole galaxy will have to choose what to do with it. And in that quiet moment, as the wreckage of the Council fleet floated among the stars, it felt like the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting to see whether that spark would fade, or burn brighter than the Council had ever imagined.